April 1861. The United States of America, a nation barely 40 years old, stood on the edge of self-destruction. In the halls of Washington and the plantations of the Deep South, the air was thick with anger, pride, and prophecy. The dream of liberty that had united 13 colonies had become two visions of the same flag, both claiming righteousness, both unwilling to yield. The wound was old as the Constitution itself. It lay in the question the founders had never truly answered. Could a nation built on freedom also live with slavery? For decades, compromise had delayed the inevitable. But by the 1850s, the balance broke. The North had grown industrial, populous, restless with reform. The South remained agrarian, proud, and dependent on human bondage. Each side saw the other not as brother, but as threat. When Abraham Lincoln, tall, quiet, and untested, won the presidency in 1860, the South saw its future vanishing. Before he could even take office, 7 states declared secession. They formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America. Its capital, Richmond, Virginia. Its president, Jefferson Davis. Lincoln faced the impossible. Could he preserve the Union without destroying its soul? In April 1861, the first shots answered that question. At Fort Sumter, a Federal garrison off the coast of South Carolina, Confederate guns opened fire. The sky above Charleston Harbor filled with smoke and flame. The flag of the United States fell, not to a foreign power, but to its own sons. The war had begun. Men cheered in the streets of Richmond and New York alike, confident it would be over in weeks. They could not imagine for years of slaughter, 600,000 dead, and a country remade in blood. For now, the cannons thundered, and the nation split. The spark that lit the inferno came not from hatred alone, but from pride, the belief on both sides that God and destiny were theirs. When the news of Fort Sumter reached the North, crowds poured into the streets. Bands played patriotic songs, flags waved from windows. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. Within days, hundreds of thousands had answered. In the South, the response was no less fervent. Planters, farmers, lawyers, and students enlisted, believing they were defending their homes, their rights, their way of life. Ministers preached that secession was sacred. Mothers wept with pride as sons marched off to war. No one foresaw the cost. The first battle, Bull Run, or Manassas, as the South called it, shattered illusions. In July 1861, 2 untested armies met in the Virginia heat. Families came with picnic baskets to watch what they thought would be a glorious skirmish. Instead, they saw chaos. Smoke filled the fields, soldiers broke ranks, and bodies carpeted the hillsides. The Union Army fled back to Washington in panic. The Confederates cheered, believing victory inevitable. But the laughter soon died. The war was no parade, it was industry turned to killing. Railroads moved armies faster than ever before. Rifled muskets tore men apart at distances unimagined. Cannons ripped through ranks with mechanical precision. Telegraph lines carried orders and casualty lists faster than grief could travel. The old codes of honor could not survive the new machines of death. And so the nation dug into trenches, into hatred, into years of attrition. No war in modern memory was so intimate. No line so blurred between enemy and kin. Brothers literally fought on opposite sides. Families were torn in two by state borders, by conviction, by chance. In one home, a Union officer wrote to his mother, "Pray for me and for my brother. He is wearing gray, and I blue. God must decide which cause is just." On the battlefield, soldiers shouted across lines, recognizing voices from the same towns. Some met between the trenches at night to exchange tobacco and coffee before returning to kill each other at dawn. The Civil War was not fought by strangers, it was fought by neighbors. The bloodiest battles in American history followed one after another: Shiloh, Antietam, Fredericksburg. Each promised resolution, each delivered only more graves. At Antietam, in a single day, 23,000 men fell, the bloodiest day in American history. The cornfields were shredded by musket fire. The creek ran red for miles. photographers captured the aftermath, the first time death itself stared back at the public through the lens. In New York and Richmond, newspapers printed the images. Mothers recognized their sons' faces among the dead. The illusion of glory died with them. The Union fought to preserve a nation, the Confederacy to preserve a way of life. But beneath those banners lay something deeper, a war over the meaning of humanity itself. Slavery, once spoken of as politics, now revealed its true face on the battlefields of the Republic. Enslaved people fled to Union lines, not as property, but as people claiming their freedom. Soldiers began to see the war not only as a fight for unity, but for justice. The heart of America itself was being remade, painfully, bloodily, irreversibly. And somewhere in a small White House in Washington, Abraham Lincoln sat beneath the weight of every telegram, every casualty list, every prayer unanswered, wondering how long a nation divided could stand before it broke forever. By 1862, the war had devoured everything it touched. Cities emptied, farms burned, and the soil itself seemed to thirst for blood. The names of battles became prayers and curses whispered across the land: Shiloh, Antietam, Chancellorsville. Each new campaign promised a quick end, each left a generation buried beneath the fields. The Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee turned the quiet banks of the Tennessee River into a slaughterhouse. Soldiers who had never seen death found themselves wading through it. 2 days of chaos left 23,000 men dead or wounded. The peach orchard where they fell blossomed red that spring, petals stained by the soil that had swallowed them. Then came Antietam, September 1862, a day that began with fog and ended with carnage. In the cornfields, men fell so thickly that one survivor wrote, "You could walk upon the bodies without touching ground." Union soldiers found Confederate dead lying side by side, hands still clasped, brothers in death if not in life. For the first time, photographers followed the armies. Their images of bloated bodies, torn uniforms, shattered trees, brought the horror into American homes. The war was no longer a distant abstraction. It was there, in ink and glass and silence. One viewer, upon seeing the photos in a New York gallery, fainted. Another whispered, "Now the people will understand." But the people did not stop the war. They only began to understand its cost. The fields of blood stretched from Pennsylvania to Mississippi. Every farm became a fortress, every town a graveyard. And still, both sides believed victory was close, if only one more battle could be won. Neither realized that victory, when it came, would demand more than courage. It would demand conscience. By late 1862, Abraham Lincoln faced a truth as stark as any battlefield. The Union could not win the war by guns alone. It had to win the soul of the conflict. For more than a year, Lincoln had fought to preserve the Union without declaring slavery his target. He feared losing the loyalty of border states, feared splitting the fragile coalition that kept the North united. But every day, enslaved people fled to Union lines, offering labor and loyalty in exchange for freedom. Every day, soldiers wrote home, saying the war meant nothing if it did not end this evil. Lincoln's heart, and history's hand, moved. On January 1, 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. By a stroke of the pen, 4 million people were declared free. The war was no longer a question of union or secession, it was a crusade against bondage itself. Lincoln's words rang through the ages. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind, and the gracious favor of Almighty God. The South raged. The North divided. But the enslaved heard, and understood. In the plantations of Georgia, in the swamps of Louisiana, in the fields of Virginia, the news spread like fire. Some fell to their knees and wept. Others sang hymns under their breath, "My chains are gone." From that moment, every Union victory meant liberation. Every defeat meant renewed captivity. The soldiers in blue no longer fought just for a flag, but for a promise. The Emancipation Proclamation transformed the war, and with it, the nation's identity. It gave moral weight to the suffering, meaning to the graves, and purpose to the endurance. As Lincoln said later at Gettysburg, this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. But freedom, like birth, would come through pain. By 1863, the war's tide began to shift, not with triumph, but with exhaustion. Both sides were bleeding, both weary of graves. In the East, the Confederate Army under General Robert E. Lee had become legend. His victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville seemed to prove that courage could defeat numbers. But Lee knew courage was finite. Supplies were low, men were starving, and the South's strength was waning. He decided on one bold gamble: to invade the North. If he could win on Union soil, perhaps Europe would recognize the Confederacy. Perhaps the North would sue for peace. So, in the summer of 1863, Lee's army crossed into Pennsylvania. There, on the rolling hills outside a small town named Gettysburg, destiny waited. For 3 days, July 1st to 3rd, thunder ruled the sky. Over 160,000 men clashed in the most cataclysmic battle ever fought on American soil. Farms became slaughter fields, orchards burned. On the 3rd day, Lee launched his final assault, Pickett's Charge, across open fields swept by Union cannon fire. Entire brigades vanished under the iron rain. When the smoke cleared, the Confederacy's dream of victory lay shattered. Lee rode among the survivors, saying quietly, "It is my fault." Gettysburg broke the Confederate advance forever. At the same time, far to the west, General Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, cutting the South in two. The Mississippi River now belonged to the Union. 2 victories, thousands of miles apart, marked the turning of the tide. The North had the men, the machines, the resources, and now, the momentum. Yet the war was far from over. For 2 more years, it would grind on through mud and misery, turning every hill and river into a line of death. In November 1863, at a cemetery on the Gettysburg battlefield, Lincoln spoke fewer than 300 words. They became immortal. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Those who stood in the rain that day could not have known the war would last 17 more months. But his words gave meaning to endurance. And endurance would win the war. By 1864, victory for the Union was within reach, but the price had become unbearable. The war had devoured 600,000 lives and still demanded more. Fields lay barren, cities in ashes, families broken beyond repair. For every battle won, another cemetery bloomed. President Lincoln, weary yet resolute, found himself leading not a nation in triumph but a nation in mourning. He walked among hospitals filled with the wounded, shaking hands with men who had no hands left to shake. Their eyes followed him, pleading not for medals, but for meaning. The new commander of the Union armies, Ulysses S. Grant, understood that meaning would only come through ending the war, utterly, decisively. He was not brilliant in the manner of Napoleon, but relentless, methodical, unyielding. Grant's strategy was simple and brutal: strike everywhere, at once. Bleed the Confederacy dry. While Lee held the lines in Virginia, William Tecumseh Sherman marched toward the heart of Georgia. Sherman's campaign, the infamous March to the Sea, redefined warfare. His army moved like a storm, cutting through railroads, burning factories, and destroying supply lines. Towns surrendered without a fight. Others were left smoldering behind him. It was not cruelty, Sherman said, but necessity. War is cruelty, he wrote, and you cannot refine it. The South's heartland crumbled. Fields of cotton turned to ash. Slaves walked behind Union lines in droves, singing hymns of freedom. The Confederacy's backbone, its economy, was breaking. In the North, war weariness grew. Mothers wept for sons lost in places whose names blurred together: Chickamauga, Wilderness, Cold Harbor. Some called Lincoln a tyrant, others called him a saint. But when he stood for re-election in November 1864, the people chose him again. They chose to finish what had begun. That winter, snow fell on both armies. Men who had once shared a flag now froze under separate skies. But the end was near. In the spring, the Confederacy's last defenses would fall, and with them, a chapter of history written in blood. April 1865. The Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia, burned. For 4 years it had been the heart of rebellion, the symbol of Southern pride. Now it was a city of fire and flight. As Union troops closed in, Confederate officials fled, setting their own supplies ablaze to deny them to the enemy. The flames leapt from warehouses to homes, consuming everything. Lincoln entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim. Dressed in black, his tall figure walked quietly through the ruins. Freedmen gathered around him, some kneeling, others crying aloud. "Father Abraham has come." He lifted his hat and said softly, "Don't kneel to me. You must kneel only to God." The war was ending, not with cheers, but with smoke and ashes. In the hills of Virginia, Robert E. Lee's army retreated westward, starving, barefoot, their gray uniforms in tatters. They marched through fields stripped bare by war, pursued by Grant's blue legions. Every mile brought more surrender, more desertion. Lee's men carried no illusions. They knew the cause for which they had bled was lost. But they still marched with dignity, determined to reach one last refuge, a small railway junction called Appomattox Court House. Grant followed close behind, not with vengeance, but with a weary mercy. He, too, had seen enough death. The Confederacy's dream of independence, of cotton, of honor, of a nation apart, was collapsing into dust. But even in defeat, the South soldiers remained proud. They believed they had fought for home, for family, for a past that was vanishing even as they clung to it. And so, in the first week of April 1865, the guns of Richmond fell silent. The Confederate flag was lowered. The Union, though scarred, still stood. But one last act remained, an ending that would echo across the centuries. April 9, 1865. The morning was quiet at Appomattox Court House, the air heavy with spring rain. A white farmhouse stood at the center of the village, the home of Wilmer McLean, a man whose property had witnessed the first battle of the war at Bull Run, and now, by chance, would host its last. Inside, two men faced each other across a small wooden table. Robert E. Lee, immaculate in his gray uniform, his sword polished though unused. Ulysses S. Grant, muddy, weary, his blue coat stained from days in the field. They exchanged polite words, soldiers, not politicians, bound by mutual respect. Grant apologized for his rough appearance. Lee replied, "All is well, General." The terms were simple: Confederate soldiers would surrender their arms, swear allegiance to the United States, and return home. They would not be tried as traitors. Officers could keep their sidearms and horses. The men could take their mules to plant spring crops. Grant's words were not of conquest, but of reconciliation. He wrote, "The war being over, the object of fighting having been to restore the national authority, I hope we may live in peace and harmony with one another." Lee read the terms in silence, his eyes glistening. When he finally spoke, it was a whisper. "It will do much toward healing our country." Outside, thousands of Union soldiers watched in solemn quiet. When they saw Lee ride away, they began to cheer. Grant silenced them immediately. "The rebels are our countrymen again." The war, the longest, deadliest, most personal conflict in American history, was over. That night, as the fires burned low, a strange stillness settled over the land. Men who had once sworn to destroy each other shared rations. Some wept, others prayed. None could quite grasp what peace meant anymore. For years, 3 million soldiers and one torn nation had come to this quiet moment, a handshake in a farmhouse. The Union was restored. But peace would not come easily. The guns had fallen silent. But in the heart of the nation, one more shot remained. April 14, 1865, 5 days after Lee's surrender. Washington was alive with celebration. The war was over, the Union restored. Flags fluttered from every window. Bands played in the streets. For the first time in 4 years, Abraham Lincoln smiled. That evening, he and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, attended a play at Ford's Theater, Our American Cousin. They took their seats in the presidential box, decorated with bunting and a portrait of George Washington. No guard stood nearby. The president, weary and gentle, believed danger had passed. But in the shadows, hatred still lived. Actor John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, saw Lincoln not as savior but as tyrant. He blamed him for the South's ruin and for granting freedom to those Booth considered unworthy. He slipped into the theater through a side door, pistol concealed beneath his coat. At 10:15 p.m., as the audience laughed at a line on stage, Booth stepped into the box, aimed his Derringer, and fired. The bullet struck the back of Lincoln's head. His wife screamed. Booth leapt onto the stage, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis! Thus always to tyrants!" He fled into the night. Lincoln was carried across the street to a small boarding house. There, doctors worked by candlelight, but it was hopeless. His breathing slowed, his face calm, as if asleep. At 7:22 a.m., April 15, Abraham Lincoln died. A Union soldier at his side whispered, "Now he belongs to the ages." The city fell silent. Bells tolled. Crowds lined the streets, weeping openly as his coffin passed. Freedmen knelt on the pavement, heads bowed. Soldiers saluted through tears. Lincoln had guided the Union through its darkest hour, and in victory, he was taken, the last casualty of a war that had killed its own father. Booth was hunted down and killed days later, but vengeance could not bring peace. The bullet that struck Lincoln did not end division, it froze it in time, leaving a wound that would take generations to heal. The man who dreamed of malice toward none, and charity for all became a martyr, not just to the Union, but to the idea of America itself. The war was over, but the peace was broken. The Union was restored on paper, yet in spirit, the country lay in ruins. Cities burned, plantations lay empty, millions freed but homeless, hungry, and uncertain of their place in a land that had once enslaved them. The task before America was monumental, to rebuild not only towns, but trust. Reconstruction, they called it. A new birth for a wounded nation. Under President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, the effort began to readmit the Southern states, to rebuild the economy, and to grant civil rights to the freedmen. But prejudice, bitterness, and vengeance shadowed every step. Former Confederates resisted federal rule. New governments rose and fell under the pressure of corruption and violence. The Ku Klux Klan emerged from the ashes, men in white robes who waged a secret war against freedom, terrorizing those who dared to vote or dream. And yet, amid the darkness, seeds of a new world took root. Freedmen built schools and churches. The Freedmen's Bureau distributed food and helped families find each other again after years of separation. Black soldiers who had fought for the Union now stood proudly in uniform, symbols of a changed nation. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th promised citizenship. The 15th gave the right to vote. The ink of these amendments was barely dry before it was tested by hate. Progress met backlash, and the dream of equality met the reality of power. But the idea that freedom belonged to all had taken root. It would not die. In the North, veterans returned home to rebuild. In the South, widows and orphans tended fields alone. The cemeteries grew green again, grass covering what had been torn open by cannon and grief. The stars and stripes flew over a united nation, but beneath it lay invisible borders of race, of memory, of pain. The Civil War had ended slavery, but not its shadow. Reconstruction would end in law what the war had ended in blood. And the work of freedom, slow, fragile, unfinished, would continue for centuries. Time has softened the edges of history, but the echoes of that war still travel across the American soil. Walk through Gettysburg today, and the wind moves through the tall grass like whispers, the voices of men who died believing they could define liberty. Visit Appomattox, and the silence of that farmhouse speaks louder than any anthem. The Civil War was not only a battle between armies, it was a reckoning between ideals. It asked whether a nation could survive its own contradictions, whether freedom could coexist with fear, whether equality was worth dying for. 620,000 dead. More than all the wars of America before and after combined. And yet, from that carnage emerged a rebirth. The Union stood. Slavery ended. A president became a legend. And the words spoken on a muddy Pennsylvania hill became the moral foundation of a century to come. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. But the price was immense, measured not just in lives, but in trust, in innocence, in the quiet sorrow of a people who learned that freedom is never free. The Civil War ended in 1865. Its questions have never truly closed. They live on in the struggles for justice, for unity, for understanding, in every argument about what the flag means, in every step toward that more perfect union. As the last veterans died, they left behind letters, photographs, and memories of a war that nearly ended the nation, and in doing so, defined it. 2 centuries later, their graves remain under the same flag, a reminder that the cost of freedom is eternal vigilance, and that the greatest battles are not fought on fields, but in hearts. The war between brothers was America's crucible. Out of it came not victory, but identity. And when the wind moves across the old fields of Virginia, you can still hear it, faint, solemn, and eternal. The drums of a nation learning how to be whole.